Okay, so today we're going to dive into something pretty interesting, I think. It's something that I think a lot of people have thought about, and it can be kind of a touchy subject.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But we're going to look at basically this idea that there's a lot of negativity directed at wealthy people, like millionaires and billionaires, right?
Right.
And it's something you hear a lot about, and I'm sure many of you listening have, like, maybe you even feel this way yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're not here to say, like, oh, you're right or you're wrong for feeling that way, but more to unpack, like, why is this such a common sentiment?
Yeah.
And to look at it from different angles, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so to do that, we're going to be taking excerpts from this source called Critique of Generalized Disdain for the Wealthy. A balanced perspective.
Catchy title.
Yeah, it is, actually.
It is.
Yeah, very descriptive.
Yeah, I like it.
So, yeah, we're going to be looking at that. And really our mission is to sort of understand what are the arguments against this negativity towards the wealthy?
Okay.
Like, why do people feel this way? What are the deeper implications of this for society?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of good arguments packed into this paper.
Yeah.
And, when you just sort of, like, accept this common feeling, I think it can be really valuable to challenge those assumptions.
For sure.
And I think this paper does a really good job of that.
Yeah. So to kick things off, let's just talk about this overall feeling, this negativity that our source points out.
Okay.
You know, this kind of automatic negative reaction that a lot of people have when they think about or hear about someone who's wealthy. Right.
Right.
And it's often expressed in a way that's, like, really generalizing. Like this idea that all wealthy people are just, like the source says, unjust, greedy corporate sociopaths.
Right. And I think that's really where this gets interesting, is like how broad this generalization is. Right. Like it's almost like a default, to think that anyone who is wealthy is somehow automatically a bad person.
And the source does acknowledge that there are obviously cases where wealthy people do bad things. Like no one's denying that.
Right.
But it's this idea of applying this label to an entire group of people.
Yeah, and I think that's where it's valuable to just pause and consider, like, is this a fair way to look at this?
Yeah, and this is where I think it gets really interesting because the author brings up this comparison that I thought was really striking.
Okay.
And it's this idea that, okay, a lot of the same people who express this, like, very strong negativity towards all wealthy people, they would condemn, making these broad generalizations about other groups.
Right. Yeah.
Like, think about how many people view racism or misogyny. Those are based on, like, rejecting these harmful stereotypes about entire demographics.
Right.
And it's about judging individuals based on their actions, right? So the source asks this really direct question.
Yeah.
Where is the consistency in our thinking here?
Yeah.
Why is it more acceptable to broadly condemn an entire group of wealthy people?
It's a good question.
Than it is, to do the same with other groups.
It makes you wonder if maybe we're taking these mental shortcuts.
Yeah.
Like our brains just like to categorize things, right? It helps us process information faster, and generalizing is kind of a quick way to do that.
Right.
But as the source points out, you lose a lot of detail and accuracy when you take those shortcuts.
Exactly, yeah.
So maybe we're overlooking the fact that there are so many different ways that people become wealthy.
Yeah.
And the impacts they have can be incredibly varied.
Right. And the source material doesn't stop there. And this is where it got really interesting to me, is that it also points out that a lot of these arguments against the wealthy often lack this historical context. Like we hear so much about wealth inequality, which is a very real and important issue.
Right.
But there's often less discussion about how free market capitalism, like as a system, has impacted global well-being over time.
Yeah, and historically speaking, that's a really important point to bring up.
Yeah, so when you look at the bigger picture, the data that the source presents is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
It talks about how there's been this massive decline in extreme poverty worldwide since the Industrial Revolution, like dropping from about 90% to under 10% in 2020.
Wow.
Which is a huge shift.
It is. It's a monumental change.
And this same period also saw this huge increase in global GDP per capita starting around the early 1800s.
And it's no coincidence, right?
Right.
Like we've seen this huge expansion of global trade driven by free market capitalism, and that's created jobs and access to cheaper goods in developing nations, which I think the source highlights as a big reason for this dramatic poverty reduction.
Exactly. And the argument isn't that capitalism is like this perfect system without any flaws, obviously.
Right, of course not.
But the source is pointing out that historically, it does seem to have had this really powerful positive impact in terms of improving living standards for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Now, the source also throws in a perspective that might make some people a little uncomfortable.
Okay.
And suggests that a big part of why people have this negative view of the wealthy could actually be envy.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And this is where the author encourages a bit of like honest self-reflection. And so for everyone listening, it might be worthwhile to think about, like, when you think about wealthy people, what are the first feelings that come up?
Right.
Is there any envy in there? Even if it's not something you like, consciously acknowledge.
Yeah. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, it's a tough question.
Yeah, it is.
But considering it can help lead to a more balanced understanding, right?
And I think it's okay to acknowledge those feelings.
Yeah.
Like it's natural to maybe feel a little envious.
Yeah.
And maybe that stems from a feeling of like lack of opportunity or that the distribution of wealth seems unfair.
Exactly. Yeah, it's definitely food for thought.
It is.
And so the source then goes on to address this really common criticism of very wealthy people, particularly billionaires.
Okay.
Which is this idea that becoming a billionaire is inherently unjust and that it must involve some form of exploitation.
Right.
And the source really challenges this assumption.
Which I think is important because it's easy to jump to conclusions without considering all the possibilities. Like, sure, there are cases where exploitation has absolutely happened.
Right.
But the source argues that it's not the only path to accumulating that much wealth.
Exactly.
Like you have examples of individuals who created immense value through genuine innovation by developing products and services that people actually want and are willing to pay for.
Right.
You know, all within a framework of free markets.
Right. And this leads perfectly into this libertarian perspective that the source highlights, which essentially argues that free markets, where transactions happen voluntarily between businesses and consumers, are actually the most just system.
Okay.
Because both parties are agreeing to the terms.
Right. There's that mutual agreement there.
Yeah.
Which is key.
Exactly. And from that libertarian viewpoint, the problem becomes when you have government intervention, like through things like extensive regulations.
Right.
Because that's seen as interfering with this natural self-regulating system.
Like messing with the supply and demand.
Yeah, exactly.
That drives a free market.
And they believe that when the government gets too involved in that relationship between a buyer and a seller, it can actually distort the market and lead to unintended negative consequences.
Makes sense.
Right. And the source goes on to talk about the economic contributions of wealthy individuals because they tend to be high earners and often high achievers.
Right.
They're seen as playing a big role in driving the economy through their productivity.
And the jobs they create in the private sector. Right, as opposed to the public sector, which is funded by taxpayers.
Yeah, which is an important distinction that the source brings up.
Yeah, for sure.
And then the source delves into this critique of government regulation, which is pretty interesting. And it's not necessarily an argument against all regulation.
Right.
But more about regulation that is maybe excessive or poorly designed or ends up actually hindering economic growth.
Yeah.
And there's this concern about unelected bureaucratic agencies having too much power.
It's interesting, right?
Yeah.
To think about how these agencies are creating rules that have the force of law.
And the source even gives some examples of what it considers to be poorly structured regulation.
Okay, like what?
Like regulations that are so complex and expensive to implement that they actually end up hurting small businesses.
Oh, I see.
And benefiting larger corporations who can afford the cost of compliance.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right, so it's really about being smarter about how we regulate.
Right, not just more regulation for the sake of it.
Exactly. Yeah, and this actually ties directly into this discussion about incentives.
Okay.
Because the source contrasts the incentives that exist in the public sector, where you have things like very strong job security in government jobs, with the incentives in the private sector, where your job security might depend much more on performance.
Right, like meeting market demands and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the argument is that these different incentive structures lead to variations in efficiency
Right.
and productivity between the two sectors.
Interesting.
So to bring this all together, the source ultimately argues that capitalism, when it's operating relatively freely—
So with less government intervention.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Is actually the most just economic model we have for reducing poverty and increasing overall prosperity.
And their argument is that this is because it empowers individuals through voluntary exchange.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Now, to really illustrate how this kind of general negativity towards the wealthy plays out in real-world scenarios, the source uses the example of criticisms often leveled at Elon Musk.
Oh, okay.
And specifically this label of unelected billionaire.
Right.
When people talk about his involvement in things like government advisory roles.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
And so the source offers a few key counterpoints to that specific criticism.
Huh.
First of all, it points out that the involvement of billionaire donors in politics is not a new thing at all.
Oh, for sure.
Especially after Citizens United.
Right.
Both sides of the political spectrum benefit from this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Secondly, the source points out that Elon Musk's designation as a special government employee is not unusual or unprecedented.
Right.
This is a classification that has been used across many presidential administrations.
Oh, okay.
Often for people with specific expertise who can give advisory input.
So it's like a temporary advisor role.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And it's basically so someone can offer their expertise to the government.
Gotcha.
Without having to become like a full-time government employee.
That makes sense.
Right. And the source suggests that maybe some of the outrage around this is because people aren't really aware of the history of this practice.
I can see that.
And finally, the source challenges this unelected criticism by reminding us that wealthy individuals have been involved in government and political donations for a very long time.
Yeah. It's not like this is a brand new phenomenon.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And it even points out that in recent years, the left has also seen a huge increase in the influence of billionaire donors.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's not unique to one side of the political spectrum or the other.
It's more about how money influences politics in general.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the deep dive goes on to examine this comedian Bill Burr's pretty critical take on billionaires and the struggles of ordinary people, which is a sentiment you hear a lot, right?
Oh, yeah.
This idea that billionaires exist at the expense of everyone else.
Right. Like their wealth comes from other people's struggles.
Exactly. So the source is encouraging us to think critically about that assumption.
Like, is there really a direct one-to-one correlation there?
Right. Is it that simple?
Yeah.
The source is asking us to consider whether there are other, more complex economic and societal factors at play.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it even raises this point that while these feelings are understandable, this perspective could maybe unintentionally contribute to this sense of victimhood.
Oh, interesting.
And discourage people from taking responsibility for their own situations.
Yeah, like it's easy to feel powerless.
Right.
When you think that everything is stacked against you.
Exactly. And then the author brings up this idea of hypocrisy among some of these wealthy people.
Like wealthy people who criticize other wealthy people.
Yes, specifically those on the left who frequently criticize billionaires while themselves living in very financially privileged positions.
Oh, okay.
And the point is, are they taking any action themselves?
Like, are they donating a significant portion of their wealth?
Right. Are they putting their money where their mouth is?
Yeah.
Because if they're so concerned about these issues,
right,
what are they personally doing to address them?
That's a fair point.
Then the source material gets into this very controversial area of taxes.
Okay.
The U.S. tax system.
Yeah, that's always a hot topic.
And the source points out this fact that often gets overlooked, which is that the top 1% of income earners in the U.S. actually pay a huge chunk of all federal income taxes collected.
Like, how much are we talking?
About 50%.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it is. And on the other side of that, those earning somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000, their contribution to the total federal income tax base is actually pretty small.
Like how small?
Often around 5% or less.
Wow.
Especially when you take into account things like deductions and tax credits.
So that means that most of the tax revenue is coming from a small percentage of earners.
Exactly. And this is important context that is often left out of these discussions.
Right. Like when people are arguing about whether the tax system is fair. Yeah.
And then the source goes on to examine how tax cuts for billionaires are often presented.
Okay.
And it uses the Trump tax cuts as an example.
Okay.
And it points out that these types of broad tax legislation often include provisions that also benefit lower and middle income earners.
Okay. Like what?
Like increases to the standard deduction, adjustments to the tax brackets,
Okay.
and expansions of things like the child tax credit.
So it's not just a simple tax cuts for the rich situation.
Okay. And then finally, the source proposes this somewhat provocative idea, which is that taxation itself, as a system where the government essentially takes a portion of someone's earnings, might actually be a more inherently unjust system than the principles of capitalism or self-interest within a free market.
So they're saying that the act of taxation is more unjust than the potential downsides of a free market?
Yeah, it's a different way of looking at things.
It is, for sure.
And finally, the deep dive briefly touches on this idea of a state-corporate nexus.
Okay.
So this is the idea that when the government and large corporations get too intertwined, which often happens through the process of regulation, it can lead to policies that benefit these powerful established players, rather than promoting competition and innovation across the whole economy.
So to recap, we've looked at a lot of different arguments against this negativity towards the wealthy.
Yes.
And we've talked about the importance of nuance, avoiding generalizations, recognizing the potential for prejudice against any group, and understanding the historical context of capitalism and its impact.
Absolutely.
And we also touched on the role of envy. And the economic contributions of wealthy people, as well as critiques of government intervention.
So clearly, this whole issue of how we view wealthy people is more complex than simple labels and gut reaction.
Way more.
And our goal today has been to encourage a more thoughtful, balanced perspective and to move beyond just accepting what we hear at face value.
Yeah, and I think this leads to a really interesting question for all of you listening.
Okay.
How might understanding the nuances of wealth creation and how it impacts society actually change your views on things like inequality and economic progress? Like, is focusing on this generalized disdain for the wealthy actually preventing us from addressing specific instances of wrongdoing or those bigger systemic issues that really need our attention?
That's something to think about.
It is.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's definitely food for thought.
Lots to chew on.
Yeah, lots to chew on.
For sure.
Okay, well, that was a really interesting dive.
I enjoyed that.
Me too, yeah.
That was good.
Definitely a lot to think about.
Definitely.
All right, thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.
See ya.